What's up? This is James, back with a YouTube video. Of course, you know who I am. Today I wanted to bring you guys something new on the channel. We're going to talk about game development, more importantly, the phases. And these are all according to me. And, well, I'm just going to jump right into it. This is going to be like, basically, if you want to know the steps that I take and the steps that I recommend to phases, and how to actually begin, how to start, how to go through it. The software will be in another video, and basically so will like things that don't correspond to this. But if you hear anything like static, I'm still working on the mic, trying to get it going, trying to get it to do correctly. And if you hear a button press, I'm doing this through slideshow. Let's move to the next slide. Here's the introduction. The concept phase, which is where it all begins. This is your drawing board, essentially. It consists of your story. You basically discuss it with people. What do you want the story to be? What about backgrounds? Basically, that's where someone who knows how to write would come into play. And then move on down to the second bullet. This would also be where like you would draw up, okay, do we want 3D or 2D? That 2 and 3 are kind of like almost the same. They're a little bit different though, because with the second bullet, you're more importantly discussing like, do we want the player to be able to jump and have a parachute? Do we want them to jump and maybe fly? Do we want them to be able to use weapons? What about open doors, closed doors, simulation? And then the design and theme is more like, how do I put it? It'd be more like, this is where the 3D and 2D would come in, but also like, Call of Duty, Sims, Grand Theft Auto, what style, things like that. Basically, that's where you would actually, your gameplay features would more importantly come after. I just made a bullet list. Your design and theme would come first, obviously. It would come before even your story or your gameplay. But you would basically there, it's like saying, okay, we're going to decide on a 3D game. Now, with that 3D game, though, do we want it to be centered around simulation, action, top-down, side, 3D, 2D, 1D? Because, you can have different, like, dimensions in a 3D and 2D game, too. Well, not really 2D, but as far as 3D, you can have, like, your first person. You can have third person. You can even have parts of it be 2D, kind of like if you've played Saints Row 4, all of a sudden it jumps to like, I think it was Blackwater. Correct me on that if I'm wrong. But you go and you save GAT from a 2D game. Now, moving on down to the environment. This is where, like, you would, okay, this is where you discuss things like, okay, do we want med packs? What do we want them to look like? Where do we want them to be? Like, okay, say for example, it's an apocalypse game. Okay, we've got a med pack. Do we want it to spawn at a hospital? Do we want it to spawn on the street? Do we want it to spawn at a house? Things like that, It'd basically be, okay, med pack. It could spawn almost anywhere in an apocalypse game. And then, say for example, somebody's modeling out something like, I don't know, a tank. They'd be like, okay, well, as far as placement goes for that, it'd be different than from a med pack. You wouldn't find one of those in a neighborhood. You'd find them, like, with an apocalypse, you'd find them, apocalypse-style games, you usually would find them in the city, or kind of like out in the field somewhere, wrecked or demolished, or at a military base, or maybe guarding something important. That kind of thing. And then you've got your building types and locations. That would be like, okay, do we want the building to be modern? Do we want it to be ancient? Do we want it to be kind of trying to describe this one? I don't really know how you would put things like 1920s to 1980s. Because, anything after 1990 is considered modern. And ancient civilizations like Rome and stuff, it's considered ancient buildings and ancient architecture. Buildings after 1990 are considered modern, so I'd kind of say it's like pre-modern type of architecture, like, 20th century, basically you could say. Like, okay, do we want it to be a game taking place in the 1930s? You discuss things like that. Do you want them to be one story, two story, skyscraper, underground? Do you want it to be abandoned? Do you want it to be like older? Now this is different than actually saying 1930 style or like, older buildings. This actually means like, do you want it to be older as in like, okay, this building is a 1930s building. Do you want it to show signs of age, things like that? And then you've got like new buildings, like, okay, do we want this building to look like it was just made or renovated, remodeled, things like that? Where do you want them at? Do you want them in a city, in the countryside? Do you maybe want them around the lake? Then you've got like also you got to decide too, like, is it a house, office, warehouse, resort, hotel, things like that. Then you move on to your NPC spawns. You'd want to describe, okay, what kind of NPC do we want? Do we want it to be enemies? Do we want it to be player friends, player enemies, humans, animals, maybe infected kind of creatures, maybe aliens, who knows? Robots. Then you move on to nature. Now, this would be more centered around things like grass, water, vines, trees. This would also play into objects, building, and the NPC, mainly building and objects. Because if sticking with the whole kind of apocalypse theme as far as describing environment, say for example, you've got a skyscraper, you want it to be abandoned. Well, you get to decide, the team, unless you're solo working, which is something that I'm about ready to get to on the next bullet when we get there. Of course, if you're reading ahead, you already see all this, but back to what I was saying. As far as that would go, though, you'd have a skyscraper that's like abandoned. No, it's post-apocalyptic. It's been so many years in the future or something, or maybe the player's been locked away. You can have trees growing through it, vines going down it, maybe even water puddles or water leaks. Then you also want to talk about wildlife. Do you want birds, crickets? Do you want sounds? Things like that. And then basically you'd want to go from there with the environment, etc. And then moving on to the next bullet. After everyone has decided and came to terms with all that, then you want to start asking, if you're solo, of course you'd be the only one doing it, unless you pay a company that's outside to do it, outsource it, where you pay somebody else, or you would buy their item off of them. But unless you're solo though, this would apply to you. You basically, whoever's in charge, whether it be you or somebody else, would explain, okay, do you want to be the environment guy who models, describes, figures out what the environment looks like? Do you want to be the character modeler, the NPC modeler, maybe even the programmer? Basically, like, what do you want to do? And then you'd sit down and basically tell this person, okay, you're in charge of Team A, which is modeling. It's up to you to make like this group decide upon which person will do what. Because within each team, like for modeling, you'd have one person doing the clothing, one person doing the character, one person doing the animating, one person doing textures, one person putting it all together, and then one person who needs to test it. if your team is that big. Of course, it would be up to whoever is mainly in charge of the team to decide on that. And then, the next one, which is very important. Some could argue that it needs to come first, but I consider it to be next to last, possibly even the last thing on the concept phase, possibly even the last thing to do at all in game development, because it's not really important yet. Because, you've got the story and everything else, but until you get the game done, you don't really know, and that is the name and the description for the game. The name, of course, you could probably decide on that as soon as you get done with the environment and everything else, because, if it's a post-apocalyptic game, it could be something like, okay, it's in a city, so maybe it's, life in the city after blah blah blah, or infection 2026 or something, something like that, to stick with the whole theme. Now the description, I recommend really thinking about it, and if nothing else, waiting till the end, because for me, I always wait till the end, because when you finish the game and you see everything that you have, like your gameplay and stuff, and you see the story completely, when it's all done, you use all that and you summarize it for the description. I really recommend waiting until afterwards. That way you've got a description that fits the final project. And then the last thing is you want to discuss marketing and decide on a strategy. Ignore the extra S there. I realized what I did. Actually, no, it's not an extra S. I just put my C in the wrong place. If no one else really cared about that, it's alright. I just kind of noticed it. It bugs me sometimes because, as you can see, I try to do things a little professional when I talk about certain items and certain discussions. I try to keep more professional than anything. But as far as this goes, you would discuss marketing. That would be more like, okay, how do we want to do this? Whenever the game is done, do we want to have trailers? Do we want to start spending a bunch of money when it's done or before it's done on like internet ads, YouTube ads, maybe television, radio, whatever? Do we want to sponsor a ball game? And then deciding on your strategy would be like, do we want to do it for 1 day, 1 hour, 1 week, 1 year, etc., etc.? And also, do we want it to be aggressive, like, really push, like you're really hitting other companies mainly? Basically, that would be something like, okay, we decide we want internet ad. Do we want to start targeting other games? Like, for instance, we'll go back to the apocalypse scenario. Oh, okay, life in the city after blah blah blah. This wonderful game, a city, bunch of environments, all this, blah blah blah, whatever. Your description, your name, all that, your marketing, internet, whatever, all that good stuff. You'd go through and describe it, and then at the end you could be like, compared to Last of Us, compared to Days Gone, life in the city has this, or compared to games like Grand Theft Auto, we take pride in such and such. Basically that would be part of the strategy. Besides, like, deciding how long you want these ads to go on and how long on things like that. It would basically, that basically coincides with that too, because if you don't have the right strategy along with the time management, it could fail. Because if you're not out there trying to really get attention and possibly even be willing to give other companies a hit and basically be willing to receive criticism from the big names, your game will not sell well. You have to be willing to, don't want this to come out wrong, but you basically have to be willing to pull a Microsoft and a Sony, basically, where Microsoft made a decision with like the Xbox One back in 2013 where they said used games weren't allowed, and Sony said, well, unlike competition, and they hand the game over. You know, basically you want to be willing to call out companies or possibly make statements referring to them but comparing your project and your product. Don't get too advanced with it though. Like, make sure that you signal out what yours is better at, but don't do it in a way to where if your project may not be as good as theirs, people can really hurt you with it, including the other company. Now, we'll move on to the next slide. And this is beginning development. This is where it all begins after the concept phase. You would have your teams all starting on like their, this is the main beginning thing. You'd want somebody to start on their models, because first things first, you would want people to actually, I don't really know how to explain this too well, but you'd want your artists drawing up models, what you want them to look like, draw up the design for the buildings, the characters, your items, odds and ends, maybe the props that are located within. You want to have somebody else create the textures or retrieve them. Retrieve would be along the lines of paying and buying textures or pulling them off of like royalty-free sites. And you'd also want to have somebody start on the story. Sorry about that. I've been talking a little while, and I gotta take a drink real quick. I'll be right back. Anyways, though, keeping with the story writing bullet, though, that is where you would basically, that's where the person would describe like characters, if your character has a background. Some games don't, and that's fine. That's perfectly okay. Some games, characters don't have backgrounds. Like, if it's dependent on the player or the players playing that character and don't really need to know, they might not ever know a background. But if it's like a different game, you could do like The Last of Us kind of did or something, and either show it in the beginning or do like other games have done and have like a description. I'm trying to think if it's not Fallout that does it, but there's games out there where before you select a character, I think Destiny may be one of them, and possibly Battlefield or older Call of Duties, something like that, where basically before you select it, it has like the name, and then it'll have, background or story, stuff like that. Mass Effect kind of does that, but with the planets and the whole wars and stuff, which is also part of the story writing too. But anyways, I was trying to use that as a reference to the character. And that also kind of covers environment background too within the story writing, which was at the end of this list of story writing. But I mean, it also revolves around the same, but I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, for things like the game story, that's basically just exactly what your game's about. If it's got a story, like if it's, most of my games have yet to really have a story. Most of them really have just a small background of, okay, this happened, or you're here, or whatever. But now, if it's a really large game, and it's like full apocalypse, if it's a full apocalypse game, and you really want players immersed within, the story would have things like, before what happened in it, maybe a little bit of during, a little bit of background and stuff on what's happening, or what had happened, and then basically maybe somewhere in it, like near the end of the whole story. I mean, of course, you'd still have your missions and stuff to write, but somewhere in it too, you can have something like, then this is where the player begins, or this is where your journey starts. But the game story would be like your missions, your side missions, before the gameplay actually begins, where the player controls. Maybe a little section completely just to the player, basically stating, like, okay, and such has been sent out, and describe it. And then it's like from there you begin. And then throughout the game, who knows, you can have the character background integrated in the story with the missions. Or with like the collectibles, which is the next point of story writing. when writing the story, if you want people to collect stuff, or even have Easter eggs, those Easter eggs can tell their own story within that story. Like, oh, okay, you find a picture of a child. That can have a whole bunch of meaning behind it. Like, that could be a picture of a family. It could be the character's family, one of the companions with the character's family, or maybe even just a random individual throughout the game that even if the player don't see him, they know that, okay, this basically describes this player or this person's life and what it was like. And then in the environment background, it's something that I consider like, it could be involved in the game story describing what happened, but also, it could also be like, if you walk into an area that is considered a plaza or a park, or maybe even in The Last of Us, how some of those buildings are, maybe one of them could have been called Joel or Ellie's Gifts or something, or Ellie's Cure, and it could be describing it, using things like that. I'm using games that people know and characters that they know to make references and to describe things that can be done. That way people have an understanding of what can be done. For me, the environment background is basically describing whatever in the environment, not really through the story. Like if you walk through a skyscraper in a game, for instance, and let's say, for instance, it's a very important skyscraper to that game, or it's a simulation game and it wants to describe that skyscraper, which is a real life skyscraper. It could have a plaque inside, or when the player walks in, there could be dialogue or a pop-up that notifies them of something or tells about the story, or it could be partly in the collectibles, but only in that building, or on the bodies, or in homes of the people that work at that building. Or even NPCs could discuss it. For me, I consider environment background to be different than the actual whole story, because that would be more, unless the part of the environment you're in is related to the story, it would be more like just giving the player an experience and an immersion level never seen. Make them feel like they're part of the world, maybe give them sadness or happiness or something about that building. Describe it to them, have them like, wow, this place was nice. And again, I'm sticking with the apocalypse thing because it's real easy to use the way that I wrote this out a lot with that. Because for the environment, it'd be like The Last of Us. How they were discussing life beforehand, only instead it could be for a building. You could walk into, it could be like a place dedicated to game consoles or something. You could have the player have dialogue that says something like, I remember buying systems here, and I remember all the kids running around, or I remember the cashier and how friendly they were. Or you could even have a happy memory instead of, I've really enjoyed coming here. This place has a lot of nice things. The power is still on, and you can come here and play anything at any time. Stuff like that. Now, on to the next bullet, and I've talked about story writing long enough. I'm sure everybody gets the idea by now. So, we'll move on to the software now. This is where you would want to decide on your game engine, like Unity, Unreal, CryEngine. If miraculously, Rockstar Games loves you and loves your company or your team and they hire all of you and let you use their engine, you'd get to use Rage. That's far-fetched, but that's a game engine too. But basically, it's like deciding on your software, game engines, things like that, which is where you would create your game, or possibly even programming your own, which is difficult to do, but it can be done. And then, you'd also want to describe, my mind's still stuck on the story thing, sorry about that. You'd also want to decide on your modeling software like Blender, Maya, AutoCAD. Maya 3ds Max, Adobe Fuse, possibly GIMP and Photoshop. I think that's the major ones that's really known about. Blender is also a game engine, by the way. I'll be describing all of these in a whole different video for each one. Like game engines will be their own video, modeling their own, programming software their own. But anyways, yeah, you'd want to also decide on your programming software. That's important. Do you want IDE included? Which basically is like if you're programming and you don't know how to spell, like for instance, I'm going to use Unity Game Engine, which is what I use. I write C# in Visual Studio. The way it works, if for instance I'm typing out input for a game in Unity, when it comes to Visual Studio, it has a Unity plugin you can install, which is basically like a download. It's like an add-on. And what it does is, I could be sitting there programming, oh, I don't know how to spell input. I start spelling it, and that plugin automatically shows me, if I type I, it'll show me anything C# related with Unity that has I in it, which could be input. It could possibly be like the name of the script I'm in, the name of another script, the word public, integer, things like that. And there's plenty of those programming softwares too. Like the major ones are Notepad++, Notepad, Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio is the actual IDE itself. Visual Studio Code is more like a lightweight, this is what you get kind of deal. And then you've got MonoDevelop, which is mainly included with Unity. I'm pretty sure you can download it separately too if you want it for other things. But it comes with Unity a lot, even though a lot of people don't really use it. People will use it, but most of the time people will use things like Visual Studio because Visual Studio, of course, like I said, I'll describe all this in another video, but Visual Studio isn't just for programming games either. Like if you want to do other software or websites, you can do anything with Visual Studio. Which is why a lot of people like it, because it's not just stuck to game programming. But moving on down to the last bullet in the starting of programming, not programming, but the beginning of the development, you want to create various projects to test and generate and create and build your gameplay features. Things like inventory, movement, maybe weapons. You want to create various projects, like have one project dedicated. Of course, this would be within the team dedicated to programming. Now, I'm going to get into this in a minute, talking about the whole don't use models yet here, because this isn't the final project. This is just coding individually each feature. Anyways, this is where you create various projects. Like if you're doing inventory in the game and you're doing weapons, create a project, a small one, to work with an inventory, get an inventory going, test it out, make sure it works great, get some things, maybe put some items in that project with it just to see if the player can pick them up and click on them and stuff. And, for the weapon one, you'd have a separate thing for the weapon one, for actually creating the weapon, making sure it fires, things like that. And then you'd move on, various projects. And then, of course, continuing development. These are the phases I consider. Like the beginning development, all things labeled development basically fall underneath the same phase, but it's different. It's sub-phases of the phase, basically. It's like having layers in a layer. Now, this is where I really want to get into it. with them extra projects, them little projects. You would want to code, like I was saying, you'd code out your features and your ideas. This is where I'll talk about the models and things, because you don't really want to use your models yet until you're ready to combine all features at once. Of course, you know, if you've got players running and you need animations, you can go ahead and write out the code and get it ready to add everything in. But you want to start, you know, this is basically just coding out. Okay, the player can open a door. Well, this project's set aside for a door, this one for an inventory, this one for weapons, this one's set aside to make sure that the NPCs actually move and do what they're supposed to, test them out. You don't really want to worry about models here too much, because this isn't really the big idea yet. If you want the models included here, you can include them, but I don't really do that until the final game. Then I really get my models going, because these are your little projects to get everything perfect before the main game, and you don't really need models for that. Models come in when you're basically about done with the game and you're ready to basically say, okay, we're putting the models in, the animations are done, that's it. Now, moving on to the next bullet, within these various projects, this is another reason why I encourage various projects. You know, you want to go through and test them, and as you're testing them, sort out major bugs and discuss with the groups. For, say, things with the inventory, say there's a bug where maybe your player walks around, he picks up an item, you open the inventory, but when you open the inventory, your player throws the item. Well, you'd have people going through, looking at the script, looking at the code, checking, seeing what may have went wrong, and you'd also discuss with the groups too about it. Say something, you know, maybe comes up, and the group's like, okay, well, why don't we have, instead of just a regular old inventory, why don't we make it colorful, or why don't we add this in with it? You know, like maybe instead of, oh, okay, the inventory has a picture of the player, his clothes, tells how hot, how cold he is, you know, temperature. But what if we also add in a map? And then boom, they start talking. And again, you'll see this, you'll see what I'm about ready to say a lot within a lot of my videos too on this. It is not applicable if you're solo. Applicable just means it doesn't apply if you're doing this on your own. Doesn't really apply if it's just 2 or 3 people, teams too. Like, not teams, but team. Because teams would mean that you probably got 2 or 3 teams of 2 or 3 people, which would kind of be a studio. But if you're just solo, well, you'd be the only one working out bugs and discussing with yourself. But moving on to the next bullet, we've got the whole exporting thing too. After you got done within the software you chose creating the actual projects, you would export things like the inventory, weapons, the opening doors and closing doors. You would export them all and get them all ready for one main project. And that's where the next bullet comes in. Start combining them one at a time. Maybe do the door first to make sure it works. Then do the inventory. But along with the inventory, after you get it done and you make sure it doesn't interfere with the door don't interfere with it, both of them still work as they should. Then add things like maybe the med packs or the water, maybe the food, maybe medicine. And then work with those 3, make sure that when the player picks up those items, it doesn't interfere with the door, because some items may be close to a door, so you want to make sure that they don't affect the actual usability or functions of the door. And then also, say for instance that maybe the inventory was working perfect with items, but maybe with it now in one big project where everything's coming together, maybe something happened and messed up. You don't want to start adding other things in until you make sure that those items are working. Because it could end up happening that you entered in, you got all the items, your med packs, your water, all your items are in the game, your weapons are in the game, but when the player clicks on them in the inventory, they either don't come up, or maybe they get thrown across the world or something, or maybe the player dies. Well, you wouldn't want to bring in something like saving, or something like possibly a map or something, anything that corresponds to the player script and code, because you might end up messing those up trying to fix the other. I've done it. I've had 3 and 4 scripts combined already, and when I went through, let me take Hellland for existence. When I was making the game, I had one big issue with the inventory where nothing worked. There are still some issues with it, but one issue I had was with like the gun and stuff, it wasn't actually equipped. I tried to add in I started adding other scripts to it too, thinking, okay, I'll just come back and fix it. Well, some of those other scripts relied on the inventory, the player, and the gun, all 3. I went through, changed one thing, and it broke the other script that I just added. That's why I recommend combining one feature at a time until you get done adding them all. And then at that point, brings you to the next bullet. You work out the bugs and glitches as they are combined and after they're all combined. This brings us to the final phase of development. This is where you import all models and all assets, which all assets should be one main project anyways at this point. Now, the main project, which is what this phase focuses on, this is actually talking about, you take that one final project, you take all those items, and you take your models, and you combine them into the final project. This right here is basically the no more projects afterwards. This is the actual game. This is where you name your scene, you create your menus, your things like that. This is where it all starts coming together, which is where the next bullet comes in. You want to make sure that all teams, or at least the leader of those teams, are nearby or have given a list to make sure that everyone's working together and to keep the team together, to make sure that all of the created work is implemented to prevent major complications. Because let's say that, maybe the models and the inventory are getting in, they're getting implemented together. And if they're implemented together wrong, the player, when jumping, may, like instead of the jumping animation playing, they might accidentally link it to the inventory. And next thing you know, there could be a lot of other issues popping up too, because it might end up selecting all the things in the inventory and then the player runs out of items. Things like that. You want to make sure teams are nearby. That way they're like, okay, listen, this is exactly the way you have to enter it to make sure none of the scripts break. Things like that. And then this brings you down to the next one. This is where you would start fixing your small coding mistakes and errors. This would be things like when you enter them all together. If one script has the player named Joe and another one has him named maybe L, well, you'd have to go through and change those. These are, and these are things, small things. This isn't really testing or anything yet. This is mainly going through, getting everything together, making sure animations line up, making sure your characters line up, making sure everything's really in there and implemented right, and at least working to a point to where you know that it's nothing small. Make sure that any removed features are completely taken out. I have been bad about leaving removed features in scripts. For instance, going back to Hellwind, the weapon in it has a fire ability to actually shoot, but I went through and edited it out to where it's not active, but it takes up 20 to 30 lines of programming, which means that script is longer, and that's also mixed in different parts of that script to where when someone goes looking through, they have to look through other things that don't even exist, which means, you want to make sure those things are taken out. Because you don't want someone opening the inventory and they're like, all of a sudden there's like a picture of an item there, but it's not in the game. It's kind of stuff like that is things that I've seen them happen in well-known games, and I've also seen it happen in my games. It starts looking for things that don't exist, and it either breaks the game, or things appear in-game that shouldn't be there because they don't actually exist. And it confuses the player because they're like, well, this don't exist. I can't walk into it, I can't pick it up, I can't use it, I can't push buttons, I can't do nothing with it. It causes confusion. Which is, like I was saying, one reason why these are just the small things. This is where you're basically getting everything ready to test. And another thing would be if you allow mods. If somebody's in there trying to mod the game and they run across features that are still there but they're not supposed to be, they're actually removed but still in the scripts, they might not be able to create a mod for the game because you've got this removed feature in the script that is referenced by everything else. Everything else is depending on it, or it depends on everything else. And because nobody actually went through and fixed it to where nothing depended on it, well, this person might go through and try to, it could be going back to the inventory. It could be something simple like maybe they're adding extra tabs to the inventory. Well, you can have a remove feature that had a picture or something in the inventory, and because it's all dependent on each other, when they try to add extra tabs, all of a sudden there's like 10 random boxes meant for pictures that all of a sudden take up the whole inventory. Things like that. But that's all that I have for this phase. Now we're going to move on, and this is now your testing and your things like that. This is what you would start playing and looking for problems. What you would be looking for are things where entering a door may cause the game to crash, things that are maybe even possibly linked to all of a sudden the computer or the game system freaks out because all of a sudden you walked into nature and something isn't optimized for performance, so all of a sudden you jump up to high usage, which causes overheating or other issues. And you're looking for things. This is where you're looking for major things. No name changes, no remove features, nothing small. This is where basically you have to be observant. Basically, to put it simple, this is where you would be looking for. Gonna try and make it sound simple. Say for instance, there's supposed to be a lake by a town. This is where you'd be going through looking and making sure that when the player walks, that lake doesn't move or disappear. And and then after that, you go to the next bullet, and this basically describes what you would want to do. You would want to fix those notice problems. Because if it's a game-breaking glitch or bug, you want to fix that to make sure that it's, actually good and not going to be a very bad experience. And that brings us to the third bullet too, which should be evident. Just because you notice something once and you fix that problem does not mean you are done. You want to constantly test, and I mean test, 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 back to back. As soon as you fix one problem, look for another. These tests are not easy tests either. Like, you have to do things, very difficult things. Like, you have to, if you've got a border on the map, you have to run into it, you have to drive into it, you have to do things to check. Even if it's things the player wouldn't be able to do, like, you may even have to take and, say for instance, you've got a debug car that goes 1,000 miles an hour. You may want to use it to really push that border to its limit to make sure that the player cannot get through. That way they don't get stuck on the outside of the map. That way, maybe a 5 mile, make sure that if a 1,000 mile an hour car can't go through it, 5 mile an hour car can't. Things like that. And, of course, this process should be repeated for weeks to months, depending on the size and difficulty of the project. Of course, if you're making something like Flappy Bird, it's probably only going to take weeks to maybe a month or two for testing. Whereas, if you're creating a game the size of The Last of Us 2, or Last of Us, or Grand Theft Auto, that might take months, possibly even a year in itself, to make sure nothing breaks. And then the last bullet for testing is basically, it is a very big bullet. The rest are important, but this right here is like a big bullet. It's like a bold bullet. I should have made it bold to represent what it basically is. Like, testing is completed at the deadline or when no game-breaking bugs and glitches are found. This basically states testing is not done until either the release date is here and you gotta release it per the date, or the company that's over your team says that it has to be done now, or when you are confident that the only glitches and bugs remaining are small ones that, if nothing else, can be patched, or may not even need to be patched because they don't affect gameplay at all. At that point, you are basically done with the game. Which brings us to the next one, release. Starting with the first, you want to start putting the marketing that you started establishing on the concept phase. You want to start using it and establishing a want from the players to acquire your game. You want to draw their attention, make them want it, make them fight for it, make them want it, make them even possibly think about killing for it. You want to really grab their attention. You want to make it to where their attention comes to you rather than others. And that ties into what I was saying on the concept phase presentation slide about the whole strategy. This all ties into that. You want to find the platforms and locations to sell your project to. Like, for instance, if your game is a computer game, do you want it on the Epic Game Store? Do you want it on your own website? Do you want it on Steam? Do you want it on maybe a different computer website? Do you want it to be in a game launcher? Things like that. And then you've got your locations, which kind of ties into the platforms, but platforms is more of like, PC, console, like, do you want it on Windows, Linux, Mac, PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, things like that. That's more platforms, but location would be like where. That's more of Steam, Epic, PlayStation Store, Xbox. Well, I think now it's the Microsoft Store for all of Microsoft's things, because I think they switched the Xbox Store to Microsoft Store also, like Windows 10 is. Now, of course, if you're releasing it on consoles, well, you probably already know at the concept phase stage. Sorry about that. I keep talking a whole lot, and I'm not really drinking anything, so my voice is going in and out. Don't know if you can tell, but anyways. If you're releasing it on console, you already know where it's going to be sold just about. It'll either be digital or on a disc. I'll get back to physical media in a minute, but if it's going to be on a console, you already know buttons, all that. You already know where it's going to be, stuff like that. Now, back to location 2. If you do physical, like a disc or even just a USB stick, location would also entail that as to where do you want it at the dollar store, at Walmart, at a pharmacy? Do you want it at your own physical store that you may run? Do you want it at an animal shelter? Do you possibly even want to put demos of it to where people can play it at these stores? Things like that. And then on top of that, the next bullet, this is where you would finally, like, say, okay, this is it. This is the final price. Basically, this is the decision of, do we want it to be 5, 10, 15, 20? This is where you would look back. This is the important part of the whole thing right here. Because finalizing the price is where you look back and decide, we spent this much time, this much labor, these many hours a day. This is how much these people want to get paid. This is how much in fees. Anything to do with money, and you want to decide from there, okay, what price do we want this? And will there be enough of a need or a want for the price to either be low, medium, or high, and us make a profit real quick? And this is also the final part for the title and description. This is where, see, the title, while yes, the concept phase, you could have decided the title, this is where you would finally agree on the title. And this is where, back to what I was saying in the concept phase, this is basically the best part for the don't know if it's popped up on your screen, but Cortana kind of just popped up. Sorry about that. Hope you can still hear me. Back to this, though. I did that for a reason, by the way, if you notice that. And if you can still hear me, I did that for a reason, to make sure that my voice is still centered and actually recording on the presentation. But anyways, finalizing the description. This is the description is the most important part. That is a summary and the capturing detail for your game. That's why I said at the concept phase, it is best to wait until the end to decide on a description, because this is where you'd look back after playing, testing, seeing all the features that are actually in the game, and you could be like, okay, welcome to such and such, or follow the tale of a man and a woman as they descend through a city destroyed by chaos. Things like that. Because that captures the attention. That's where someone's going to read it and be like, oh, that's nice. And then, on to the next bullet. You want to release 1 to 4 trailers, depending on the project. That could be things like, for instance, gameplay, the reveal trailer. Reveal trailer is one of the important ones, because that's the first trailer, and that's where you want to capture people's attention and get them hyped for any other trailers in the game itself. But you want to capture them with that one, but also with a gameplay trailer. Depending on how many trailers you want to release, your final trailer should basically capture the remaining attention that you want. And then from there, this is where it comes in for release. This is where you actually go, okay, and you upload it to whatever platform, whatever online store you sell it to, or whatever online store that you are putting it on. And this is also where you would contact companies and have them start doing physical disc, a physical case, physical USB, physical books, things like that. And then the final part, this is where you're done with it all. Release updates if the game needs them. And what I mean by that is some games developers don't update. They just leave them as is. And that's perfectly okay. There are still games made that are like that honestly they do well without updates because they don't. While yes, they probably have bugs, as no game is perfect, at the same time, the developers are like, okay, this game may be $5, $10, $15, maybe $60. The bugs aren't real bad. We're not going to release any updates. It's perfectly okay to do that, because a lot of times that gives you extra time to maybe take a break, make a little bit of profit, take a little bit of a vacation, and rest some. And also to start thinking about the next game and go back to the concept phase and start all over again. But that is the phases for game development that I personally use. And, well, I hope that you enjoyed the talk. If you want to start a discussion or want to hear anything else, or even want to see the games that I have created, go to any of these links to view the games that I've created and any work that I label underneath Reality Games. Go to the RGRDC website at realitygamesrdc.wixsite.com/realitygamesrdc. And if you want to actually visit my channel sometime again in the future, or somebody that may like this kind of material, send them to this link, youtube.com/UC3EOE QCYVKAULBU4FTPCGYW, or youtube.com/C/Cook7039. I think it's /C. Or it's youtube.com/channel/C/Cook7039. And if you would like to contact me on the forum or contact Reality Games on the forum, you can visit Reality Forum at realitygamesrdc.wixsite.com/reality/, well, not really slash, it's more of a hyphen forum. And with that, I'm going to leave you to it. And I'll also have things after this, like I'll have my channel picture for you to subscribe to. Make sure to do that. Subscribe and like, and also comment, leave some feedback, let me know anything else. And I'm also going to start linking, I'm going to have probably best for viewer video 2, like I have had here recently. And I'll have the playlist ready to link up to constantly watch from the end of videos like this. Of course, with this being the first video, it'll be the only one there for now until I get more in there, so that link, probably YouTube ain't gonna like it, but I'm still gonna do it anyways. Hope you enjoyed. This has been James. I'm glad you joined me for this talk and this presentation. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you like it. Make sure you keep your notifications on for more, because I'm going to start doing more things like this. But I hope you do like it, and I hope you're learning something, and I hope that you achieve any goal you want to achieve in your life with game development. If this is a career you want, if you want to be a programmer, an artist, designer, whatever it is, if you want to do anything with game development, I hope this helps. And with that, I'm going to catch you in the next one.